Hello everybody, and welcome to this video on Langston Hughes. And in this video on Langston Hughes, we're going to discuss the Harlem Renaissance, and then we're going to take a look at the two poems that you have been assigned for this, which are Harlem and the Weary Blues. So, as with most of these videos, I've probably told you this before, but I'll go ahead and repeat it. It's good to go ahead and pull that PowerPoint slideshow that I've got in the Georgia View page or the D2L page, whatever you want to call it, up. And follow along with me as I go along with this. So if you haven't done that already, go ahead and open up that little slideshow and hit the play button. Pause this and then do that and hit the play button whenever you're done. Alright, so let's talk about this. We'll start with the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance, very simply, was an arts movement. And the purpose of this arts movement was to try to bring about equality between the blacks and the whites with art instead of with protests and violence and stuff. All of this Harlem Renaissance stuff was pre-Martin Luther King Jr., pre-Malcolm X, prior to the civil rights marches and things of that nature. All of this occurred in the Harlem area of New York in the 1920s and a little bit into the 1930s, but mostly into the 1920s. So, if you look at this, you'll see a little history there. What had happened was the subways did not go as far north as they do now. The subways only went about as far as maybe 100th Street or something like that. They did not go as far as Harlem, and they did not go as far as the Bronx. So some builders decided they were going to build some nice houses in the Harlem area in the hopes that people would want to move there. But without public transportation, a lot of those houses sat empty, and basically the builders had overbuilt. So essentially, two African-American developers who were pretty smart bought those houses very cheaply and then sold them to African-American families. And then, of course, later the Puerto Ricans would move in and the other ethnic groups that are a part of Harlem. But it was the African-Americans that first moved there. And so they went up there because the housing was more affordable than what it was, say, in Manhattan or some of those other areas. Now, the Harlem Renaissance at this time was spearheaded by several people, and W.E.B. Du Bois was an African-American political leader, and he was an academic, and he was a thinker. The NAACP was founded in Harlem, so if you're familiar with the NAACP, the organization was founded in the Harlem area. Then you got Marcus Garvey, the founder of the Back to Africa movement. In this case, Back to Africa movement means people that want to go back to African music, African clothing, African names, African all kinds of other things. So he was from that area. And then, of course, the National Urban League, as you can see, was founded in the early 20th century as well. This was also another organization designed for the advancement of the African American issues. So the Harlem Renaissance itself, as I've already mentioned, this is the next slide now, was a major African American arts movement. Its purpose, as I have said, was to achieve racial equality through the arts. Essentially, their hope was that if white people would listen to black music and appreciate black painters and go to black plays, that eventually equality between the races would actually improve through that. And it was mildly successful, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. It wasn't as successful as the major thinkers and major players in the Harlem Renaissance had hoped it would be. If it had been, we would not have had the civil rights riots of the 1960s, but it was somewhat successful. And so the Cotton Club was a very interesting place. It was a place where all of the richest and most famous people went to go see black entertainers, such as Louis Armstrong, such as Bessie Smith or Lena Horne, among others. And yet, the same black entertainers that were entertaining the town's elite had to go in through the back door, the service entrance. They weren't allowed to actually go through the front door and sit at the tables and eat the same food that all of these other people were allowed to do, all of the white folks were allowed to do. And yet, they were a major part of the actual entertainment itself. And for many years, it was the toast of New York City. All right, so here are some notable. The next slide is some notable Harlem Renaissance artists. I think in music, especially, you're going to recognize some of those names, but perhaps in literature also. Langston Hughes is who you're reading for my class. Zora Neale Hurston wrote a book called "Their Eyes Were Watching God," and it's a very, very good book. It's set in a little black community down in Florida, and I have actually taught that book before. It's really good. We go to drama, of course. You've got Langston Hughes again. If you go to the intellectuals, you'll probably recognize some of those names, particularly W.E.B. Du Bois and particularly Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was an old man by the time the Harlem Renaissance started, but he was still an important figure in that Renaissance. So those are some names. You can Google them if you have time. You can look them up and see just how important they were. All right, so now we get to Langston Hughes. Let's give you a little biography on Langston Hughes. He was born of mixed heritage. His mom was completely black. His dad was half and half, half black, half white. Langston Hughes' dad kind of abandoned him when he was a baby. So he did not have a good relationship with his father. He would reconnect with him later in life, but it was always a contentious relationship. So because Hughes hung out with his African-American mom or his African-American aunts and grandparents and things like that, he very much identified with the black part of his heritage a whole lot more than the white part of it. So he was born in Joplin, Missouri, grew up there. He started writing poetry in elementary school. He considered himself the school poet in elementary school, even though the school didn't really have an official school poet title. He would go on to college. He would go to a year at Columbia, leave there. He would end up going to an HBCU up in Pennsylvania called Lincoln University, where he would get his degree. He was one of those rags to riches story. He was actually bussing tables at a Washington, D.C. hotel when he ran into Lindsay Vachel, who was a very important poet of the time. He showed Vachel some of his work, and Vachel was so amazed that he basically introduced Hughes to the right people, and Hughes would then go on to become a major figure in the Harlem Renaissance, particularly in the art of poetry, but also in plays as well. One particular play he wrote was one called Mulatto, which is a very good play if you ever get a chance to read it. Okay, so that's a little background on Hughes. He did die in 1967. His remains are interred in a building in Harlem. You'll have to Google it because I don't remember the name of the building, but he is interred in a building, in the lobby of a building somewhere in Harlem. And you could visit that if you were interested. All right, let's take a look at the poems. And we're going to start with Harlem. You can see that Harlem is only 11 lines long. It's a very, very short poem. And it is full of graphic imagery. But notice that Harlem itself is never mentioned anywhere in this poem. So that's kind of unusual. Why in the world would this poem be titled Harlem if it's not mentioned, Harlem itself is not mentioned in the poem? Well, let's start with that opening line. What happens to a dream deferred? Now, that word deferred is an important dream, or an important word. The dream, if you can think of this, remember this poem was published in it says right there 1951 in your textbook. So it was published in 1951. This is a good 20, 25 years after the Harlem Renaissance had pretty much given up. But the dream's not dead yet. It's only deferred. And deferred is defined as put off or postponed. So really what our narrator here is saying is what happens when a dream gets postponed. And the dream we're talking about here is the dream of the racial equality, is the dream of peace, harmony, love that the Harlem Renaissance had been hoping for. And so he's going to try and answer this question with another series of questions. In fact, this whole poem is a series of questions. So let's take a look at the imagery here, because he's going to use very graphic imagery to make this deferred dream seem like something that has gotten rotten or something that has spoiled, if you will. So he opens it up with, does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Now granted, a raisin is already a dried up grape, but if a raisin sits out in the sun too long, it's going to dry up, it's going to harden. and it's not going to be very edible anymore. In fact, you might even chip a tooth on it for all we know. So, this raisin that could have been tasty in its raisin form, once it continues to dry up and turn into something as hard as stone, it's no longer edible. Just like a dream might harden and turn into stone over time if it's not fulfilled. Or fester like a sore and then run. So what do we mean by a sore running? Well, obviously we mean the pus coming out of it. And it smells bad, and it's really gross to look at. And so it's really, it's kind of an infected sore. If you get a sore, let's say you get a cut on your finger, and you treat it immediately with some kind of antibiotic, and perhaps put a Band-Aid on it, it'll probably heal just fine. But if you let it go, it can become infected, and it'll start to smell bad, and it'll start to hurt worse, and it'll start looking really, really ugly. And it could lead to amputation because of gangrene. So, this dream that has not been fulfilled yet could be likened to a sore that is actually infected and getting much, much worse. Next question, does it stink like rotten meat? Picture a steak, if you will. A nice, juicy, delicious steak. And when it's fresh, now if you're a vegetarian, I apologize. I myself am not a vegetarian. I love a good steak. Give me a nice thick ribeye, cooked medium rare, and I'm a happy guy. Season it just right. That steak can be delicious. That steak also has nutritional value. It has protein, which protein is used to build muscles. But now take that same piece of meat and don't cook it. Instead, let it sit out and go rotten and start going to spoil. It'll change color. It'll really start to smell bad. And really, you can't eat this steak anymore, because eating the steak will actually make you sick instead of having any nutritional value. It'll have the opposite effect that the fresh steak had. So, if it starts stinking like rotten meat, you cannot eat it because it'll make you sick. So perhaps this dream that has been postponed is, if it's become bad over time by not being being fulfilled. Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet. Who doesn't like Krispy Kreme donuts? And I know that some people prefer Dunkin' Donuts. That's fine, but let's think about your favorite donut right now. When it's fresh and it's just come out of that cooker, and it just smells so good it makes you salivate, and it's soft, and that glaze is still wet, and it really, really tastes good. But over the course of a day, that donut will become stale, and it will harden a little bit, and then that glaze will harden as well, and it will become flaky, and it's just not the same anymore. So it's just not as sweet anymore. Just like the dream would have been sweet had it been fulfilled at one time, but it's just not as sweet anymore. Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Think of this, if you will. Imagine that you've got this weight on you, and it just weighs you down and weighs you down. Maybe like a backpack full of clothes. If you've ever been in the military and had to march with a full backpack on your back, perhaps it got heavier as you continue to march. Now, it didn't literally get heavier, but it sure felt that way, and it started sagging on your back and started dragging you down. Just like this dream that hasn't been fulfilled. It's dragging people down. It's holding them back. It's slowing them down, making it more difficult to move forward. So perhaps the dream does that. And then we got the final one. Does it explode? Think about what causes an explosion. Think about how pressure builds up from within, and builds up from within, and builds up from within, until finally the container cannot hold that pressure anymore, and boom! And it just explodes. And perhaps this could be a warning from our narrator that if we don't fulfill this dream of equality, things will explode and the situation will get a lot worse. And lo and behold, as we continue on studying our history beyond 1951, we realize, yes, there were plenty of explosive moments in the civil rights movement. And there still are even today if you look at the news. So, perhaps if this dream doesn't get fulfilled, it explodes and causes a big mess. It causes injury. It could cause death. Because it just can't be contained anymore. So, that series of questions about Harlem and about the dream being deferred is a very important series of questions that our narrator's trying to answer. Alright, let's go to the next poem, which is The Weary Blues. Remember when I mentioned the Cotton Club, talking about the Harlem Renaissance? This poem takes place outside and, to a certain extent, inside of the Cotton Club. We have a narrator that's a young man standing outside, which raises the question, why must this young man stand outside? Why can this young man not be inside watching the entertainment? And I think that if you remember what the criteria for being allowed through the front door is, you'll probably understand that our narrator is an African American man and not so much a white person. So, I'm not going to go through this one line by line. What I have done is I have put a link in your poetry folder to Langston Hughes. That really is Langston Hughes in that video, reading The Weary Blues while being accompanied by an orchestra. And it's really cool to hear him in his own voice read this poem while at the same time you hear the music in the background. And I think it adds to the reading experience. Again, imagery is very, very vivid in this poem. And I'm going to take a look at a couple of those moments. But essentially, this is a young man who is standing outside of the Cotton Club, listening through the walls to this musician perform, and picturing what might be going on inside. And then, of course, he's picturing what might happen when the narrator goes home. So he hears them play. He's standing on Lenox Avenue, doing the lazy sway to the tune of those weary blues. Right here on line number 9, I love this image. With his ebony hands on each ivory key. So he's got ebony hands, so they're very, very black. Ivory keys are very, very white. Now, if those ivory keys sit there and nobody presses them down, they cannot make any kind of music, right? They can't create the beautiful music just by sitting there with nobody pressing them down with their fingers. So here is a man with ebony hands, an African American man, who's using those ebony fingers in conjunction with those white keys to create a beautiful sound, to create beautiful music. And that is that can be likened to the need for blacks and whites to work together, because together they can create the beautiful music that cannot be done alone. So I love that little image there. He's making that poor piano moan with melody. It's not music. It's not happy, ragtime, upbeat music. That piano is moaning out the music. So the piano is suffering as well. Alright, so he keeps going down. He's keeping time with his foot, so on and so forth. We get to the actual song itself. This is about line, I'm going to say 16 or 17. In a deep song voice with a melancholy tune. What is melancholy? Well, it's sad, right? So, he's got a sad tune going on. I heard that Negro sing that old piano moan. And look at the words to his songs. Ain't got nobody in all this world, ain't got nobody but myself. I'm gonna quit my frowning and put my troubles on the shelf. He keeps thumping. I got the weary blues and I can't be satisfied. Got the weary blues and I can't be satisfied. I ain't happy no more. I wish that I had died. Weary blues. Why do you suppose our old man sitting at the piano is so weary? Is he weary just because it's late at night? Or is he exhausted from a lifetime of fighting for equality and not getting it? For a lifetime of bowing down to the man and not getting any satisfaction out of it. Here he is, an old man. Nothing has changed, and he is still got the blues. You know, he's exhausted. He has spent his whole life working. He has spent his whole life fighting, and yet he hasn't brought about any change. So, you know, what's the alternative? Well, he kind of wishes he had died. All right. So then the man goes home, and let's take a look at those last 2 lines of the poem. While the weary blues echoed through his head, he slept like a rock or a man that's dead. Why does he sleep so deeply now? Why on this particular night has our narrator or has a musician actually decided to sleep well? Well, did he literally die? I mean, what happened here? So that raises the question, right, of why did he sleep so well on this particular night, and did he die, or was it just that he slept like a man that was dead and he's going to wake up the next morning? That's a question to ponder as you finish this poem. So the Weary Blues really, I think, captures a mood and captures somebody, because it was published in 1926. It really captures the frustrations of an old man who's been fighting and working his entire life only to get nowhere. So that's Langston Hughes. That's the Harlem Renaissance, and that's Langston Hughes. I hope you have found this video informative. I hope that it helps you to understand these poems well and to develop a greater appreciation for the genius that is Langston Hughes.